بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فإن أحسن الكلام كلام الله وخير الهدى هدى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وإن شر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. So today is our 13th lesson in our series on this book, Taqreeb or Tadmuriyyah. And in the previous lesson we started looking at the different groups, the various factions who are the subject of the remaining part of this book. These are various factions from the people of philosophy and kalam, and they have positions with respect to Allah's names and His attributes and His actions. And the purpose behind the previous two lessons was to make sure that we have a good understanding about these groups and why they say what they say, what are their actual views, and just to explain a little bit about each group or sect so that you have a basic appreciation, because each of these groups will be addressed systematically, and their arguments will be systematically addressed. So obviously it helps if we from the outset have a clear understanding of what these groups are and why they say what they say. So we got to, in the previous lesson, we got to the Mu'tazila. The Mu'tazila, we completed our discussion of them. And just as a quick recap, we said that the Greek philosophers like Aristotle, Plato, they just studied nature, tabi'ah, and they devised a system of physics to describe nature. And so Aristotle came with his 10 categories, that everything that we see in nature is a substance and its attributes. A substance and its attributes, right? Jawhar and its a'rad. Jism and its a'rad. So, on the basis of that, they said that whoever is behind the universe, behind this creation, they call it the first cause or the prime mover, then this being has to be completely and totally other than what we observe and experience. And because they devised this system of describing nature, this is a jism and it has these properties and attributes, they considered the perfection of this maker or this first cause or this prime mover to be tied to this very same language, right? So, in other words, perfection lies in negating, and you can see on the back here of this handout, these are the 10 categories of Aristotle, right? So to them, divine perfection kind of really lies in saying that this being is not a substance, it doesn't have quantity, it doesn't have quality, al-kam wal-kayf, it doesn't have any relation, al-idafa, it doesn't have al-ain, which is a place, location, it's not subject to time, right? Doesn't have any position, doesn't have any action, doesn't have any activity, right? Doesn't have any affection, meaning that it cannot be affected by other things. So really the idea they came up with was it ended up being really just a concept in the mind. It's an idea of perfection which exists really only as an idea in your mind, right? And so this was the general idea that they had. So we explained that for whatever reason, this entered the Jews, the Christians, the Sabi'ah, and some people from among the Muslims were interacting with these people, debating with them, and they brought this poison into the Muslim nation. And so the first of those groups are the Jahmiyyah, These are the first people which appeared in the early 2nd century. And as far as what they believe, this is the closest to those Greek philosophers, right? Really, they don't describe Allah with any name, with any attribute, with any action, because, they say that if we assign any name to Allah, then there's nothing that we see in the creation or anything which has a name, except that it's a body, right? So if we say, someone is the wise, or is the hearing, or is the merciful, right? Then we do not see that, except that it is a body which has to, so that you can see it's the same type of reasoning that they use. So they denied everything. We can't give any names to Allah, can't give any attributes to Allah, can't ascribe any actions to Allah. So in essence, what they were reducing Allah to is a mere concept in the mind only, right? Because this type of being that you're trying to imagine, which is like an abstract notion of being one, right? If you just try to think in your mind and think of oneness, the idea of oneness, and you do not allow any other meaning to enter into that notion, right? So there's no wisdom, there's no mercy, there's no power, there's no anything else, right? You eliminate every other meaning, and it's just like an abstract notion of oneness. Then really, all you're believing in is a concept in your mind, because this doesn't exist outside of your mind. No such thing exists outside of your mind, right? So the Salaf recognize that this is a call to pure atheism. Right? This is a call to pure atheism. And on that basis, these people began to deny what is in the Quran and the Sunnah, that Allah Azza wa Jal is separate and distinct from His creation. He's other than His creation. He is above His creation. That He is described with beautiful names, lofty attributes, that He is the creator, the provider, the sustainer, the most merciful, the all-hearing, and so forth. That's the position they were upon. The Mu'tazila, as we said, they took this idea and they saw that very clearly in the Quran, Allah Azza wa Jal is attributing names to Himself, assigning names to Himself. So they thought it to be, that if we were to deny the names, it would bring scorn upon us. So they said, we'll affirm the names, but these names do not represent any attributes. Right? This is pure sophistry. Right? They're saying Allah is the all-hearing. Yes, we affirm that He's as-Sami', but He doesn't actually have the attribute of as-Sami'. Right? Allah is the all-powerful, but He doesn't actually have the attribute of power. What is power? Power really is something which He creates in His creation, and then it is said to be His power. If you know what that means. Meaning there is power, but it's not an actual attribute of His. Power is only the power He creates within His creation, which is then ascribed to Him, right? So they don't affirm any attributes for Allah, and these attributes of wisdom, mercy, knowledge, they say these are just the created things which are in His creation. There's wisdom in creation, there's power in creation, there's mercy in creation, but these are things which are creations of Allah. And so we can say that this is the mercy of Allah, this is the creation of Allah, this is the wisdom of Allah. Just like we say, for example, the Kaaba is the house of Allah. The Kaaba is a created thing. And it belongs to Allah. Allah owns it because He is its creator. It's in that sense that they say, Allah has mercy. These are created things which occur in the creation. Not that Allah has an actual attribute. And the reason why they said this is because they treated, these attributes have meanings, obviously, and they treated the meaning to be a thing in itself, an entity. So if you say Allah has knowledge, Allah has power, Allah has wisdom, according to them, you have now basically affirmed 4 eternal beings. And this is futile, it's false. Right? Because we know that a single entity can have many descriptions, yet it is still a single entity. Right? We have one man, he's a father, he's a son, and he is a husband, and he is, he has a profession. Maybe he is, like a baker or a tailor, whatever it might be, and he's generous, and he has wisdom, and he has, these are all meanings which the mind separates out, but the man is still one, right? And so the Mu'tazila fell into this type of basic sophistry, and this is what the poison of philosophy does to you, right? So that's what they were upon. And then we came to the Ash'aris and Maturidis, and the Ash'aris and Maturidis are basically what we are going to discuss today. And because the first group which is discussed are the Ash'aris and Maturidis, and that's because they are least in their deviation, and therefore they are closest to the people of the Sunnah, even though they are upon deviation. And so their doubts are obviously the first doubts that should be looked at and analyzed. But before we do that, just a quotation at the bottom here of the page. In fact, we finished on this point in the last lesson. We said that there are only really two non-contradictory, coherent viewpoints, right? There are only two viewpoints, really, in truth, which are consistent and coherent, and which abide by the principles, right? So either you say that Allah is not a body like the bodies, and so therefore we have to negate every single name, attribute, description, and we can't assign anything to him. We can't affirm any positive attribute for him, and we have this idea of absolute oneness, and so we deny everything, right? No names, no attributes, no descriptions, no actions, no nothing, whatever, right? So this is really here on this side of the scale, the philosophers and the Jahmiyyah, and they are largely consistent and coherent, right? They're sticking by by the principle that they're operating upon, right? On the other side, the people of the Sunnah here, and we have a uniform, consistent, coherent principle, which is that our knowledge of Allah is taken from revelation as a principle. Whatever Allah has affirmed for himself or assigned to himself by way of a name, by way of an attribute, by way of an action, then we know that because Allah Azza wa Jal, his essence or his being is unlike the creation, then therefore his names, attributes and actions are unlike the creation. And so there's no caution, there's nothing wrong in us affirming for Allah what he affirms for himself, and negating for Allah what he negates from himself, while negating any likeness, right? And this uniform principle we apply to everything that we see in the Quran and the Sunnah, right? And we are coherent. There's no contradiction in any of this. Now, if you try to go anywhere in the middle, so you say, well, okay, I'll accept the names but not the attributes. Or you say, well, okay, I'll accept some of the attributes but I deny other attributes. You are going to fall into a blatant and very apparent contradiction. And even though you might try to play all of these games and tricks, linguistic tricks, and you bring all of these kind of devices in argument to try to make it look as if everything is coherent, upon examination and scrutiny, like what we are going to do in the rest part of this book, it's all going to fall into pieces, right? And so therefore, there's a great statement made by one of the scholars called Yahya bin Ammar, and he was in the 5th century. This was really at the early period when these Ash'aris, when they appeared. And he has a very nice statement, and he says that Al-Mu'tazila مخانيث الجهمية والأشاعرة مخانيث المعتزلة. What does this mean? It means that if we take a look at the Mu'tazila here, really these are just like the effeminate There's like the effeminate among the Jahmiyyah. Right? So you have the men, and then you have the makhanith. This, like in English, what would you say? You'd say effeminate is like one of the words. You could also say maybe this is a bit more, maybe the word is a bit more, it's kind of like a slur, really. Like maybe you could say like a sissy. A sissy is like someone who's effeminate. It also means someone who is a coward. Right? So in other words, the Mu'tazila are not really, they're not real men. They're not real men. Because you are not brave enough and you are not man enough to abide by what your principles really and truly require from you. The Jahmiyyah did that. The Jahmiyyah said this principle requires from us to negate every name, attribute, action from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so therefore we say, Allah does not have any names, attributes, actions. He's not above his creation. He does not have wisdom. He does not have mercy. He's not the most merciful one. He's not the we don't affirm any of this, right? They're consistent. And they stick by that. And what you guys, the Mu'tazila, are trying to do here in the middle, you're trying to just prattle around, trying to just play these silly little games, whatever. And you're not real men. And similarly, the Ash'aris in turn, they are the effeminates of the Mu'tazila. Right? So they're not bold and brave enough like the Mu'tazila to basically deny all the attributes. They're saying, well, we'll affirm some and we'll negate others. Whereas the actual principles you are acting upon and abiding by necessitate and demand from you that you deny all the attributes. Right? So once again, why are you prattling around and, like this? Instead of just being real men, why don't you just say, we'll negate all the attributes and we'll be real men like the Mu'tazila. Right? And so when it comes to actually scrutinizing their position and analyzing their arguments, we will see the futility of their argument. It will all fall apart. Right? So this is a very nice statement from Yahya bin Ammar. And obviously the Mu'tazila and the Ash'aris don't like this to be said. It's a very not a nice thing to be said, is it? That you're from you're the makhanif of the Mu'tazila or the Jahmiyyah, but it is a truth. And when it comes to the actual arguments and showing your consistency, then you will have nothing to stand upon, and all that you can respond with is emotional outbursts and emotional tantrums and things like this. That's really what you get back. Name calling and slurs and whatever. But when it comes to the actual, sound reason, sound argument, you have nothing to stand upon. So with that said, we can now proceed. So if you recall, in lesson 10, we looked at all of those groups which oppose the people of the Sunnah. The first group that we looked at were the Mushabbiha, right? Those who liken Allah to His creation. This is very easy to deal with, right? And so we discussed that. And then we were about to discuss the Mu'attila. Mu'attila are the negators. Those who negate Allah's names, attributes and actions. But before we proceeded into that, we obviously had to have a somewhat of an appreciation about these groups and where they stand and what they hold, so that the arguments will then become clear and apparent. So we now proceed again back to the text itself, and so we're in the chapter Fasl wal Qism al-Thani, the second group. This is on page 24 if you have this book here, 24 if you have that one, and it is page 170 if you have the the large book, the explanation here, page 170. Right? So the Shaykh says, wal Qism al-Thani, the second group, al-Mu'attila. Al-Mu'attila. So these, as we know, are the negators, the deniers. And they are the ones, وَهُمُ الَّذِينَ أَنْكَرُوا مَا سَمَّ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى ووصف به نفسه إنكارا كليا أو جزئيا. These are the people who denied what Allah named himself with names, and what he described himself with, attributes. And they did so either fully, completely, so they denied everything, which is the Jahmiyyah, or they did partially, which is the Mu'tazila, Ash'ariyah and Maturidiyah. And on account of that, وَحَرَّفُوا مِنْ أَجْلِ ذَلِكَ نُصُوصَ الْكِتَابِ وَالسُّنَّةِ. On account of this rejection, they then came to the texts of the Quran and the Sunnah, and they began to distort these texts. فَهُمْ مُحَرِّفُونَ لِلنُّصُوص. So therefore they are distorters of the texts, مُعَطِّلُونَ لِلصِّفَاتِ, and negators of the attributes. وَقَدْ انْقَسَمَ هَؤُلَاءِ إِلَىٰ أَرْبَعِ طَوَائِفِ. And these people are divided into 4 factions. So these are the 4 factions that you can see. Yes, the philosophers, the Mu'tazila, the Ash'aris and Maturidis, and of course the Jahmiyyah before that. So the Shaykh goes on to explain the first group, الطائفة الأولى الأشاعرة ومن ضاهاهم من الماتريدية وغيرهم. So the first group then we're going to look at are the Ash'aris and the Maturidis. And these people, you find them all across the world, all across North Africa, all across, Syria, Iraq. And the Maturidis are largely Hanafis. They are in, Pakistan and India, and those places like like Turkey, for example, and Turkmenistan, and those kind of distant areas, between China and and Iran and Iraq. That area generally is largely Hanafi, and likewise in the Far East, where you have in Malaysia and places like that, these are Shafi'is in fiqh, but they are Ash'aris in creed, right? So these people are present today in the millions. This is not some creed which has come and gone and disappeared. No, these are people who are present today, and they've inherited this doctrine. So they are the Ash'aris and whoever resemble them. So the Shaykh gives a quick explanation of who these people ascribe to. This is a man called Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, and he was in the 4th century after Islam. He was born around maybe 360, something along those lines, maybe 260 to maybe 240, 250, in the middle of the 3rd century, roughly. And for the first 40 years of his life, he was actually a Mu'tazili, right? So if you see here, the one who is said to be the founder of the Ash'ari madhab, he was actually a Mu'tazili for 40 years of his life, right? Because his mother married one of the heads of the Mu'tazila. So he was raised in that household. So he was upon this doctrine, the Mu'tazili doctrine, for for 40 years of his life. However, Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, he actually had 3 stages in his life, and at the end of his life, he actually came back to the way of the Sunnah. Right? So the first part of his life, he was a Mu'tazili for 40 years. Then there were some issues that, in the Mu'tazili creed that weren't really making sense, and he couldn't get answers for them from the heads of the Mu'tazila. So he abandoned that, and then he found himself, in the city that he was in Iraq. There were certain gatherings, of knowledge of the followers of Ibn Kullab, right? So he then adopted this doctrine of the Kullabiyyah. There's a man called Ibn Kullab. I think we mentioned him previously. But he was then upon the way of the Kullabiyyah. And the Kullabiyyah, they affirm pretty much the names and most of the attributes, but they deny some attributes which are tied to Allah's will. So he was upon this doctrine for a while, and from that point onwards, he then went through a transition period where he eventually adopted what the Salaf were upon, what Imam Ahmad was upon. And this was really the third part of his life. The third stage. Now the Ash'aris, they don't take from the third part of his life. So really this is like a contradiction, because you claim to be Ash'ari, you ascribe yourself to this man, to this scholar, and you know full well that at the end of his life, he clearly went through a transition, and he wrote certain books at the end of his life. There's a book called Al-Ibana an Usul al-Diyana. Right? This book Al-Ibana, in this book, on the whole, he is speaking and he explicitly states that he is upon the way of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal. And everything in this book is in accordance with the Sunnah, apart from obviously there's the things which he was still affected by and influenced by, from his past. So there are some kind of issues in that book, but on the whole, it is, very close to what the people of the Sunnah are upon. So the Ash'aris do not take from this book. Why do you not take from this book? Why do you say that you are Ash'ari? When the man repented from what he was upon in the first part of his life, and also the middle part of his life as well. So why don't you follow what he was actually upon? And you will see that they will not do that. Right? And you will see that we'll try to find excuses to not accept what's in the final book, Al-Ibana. They will say, it was fabricated against him. People fabricated the book. This is one of the excuses that they give. This book, Al-Ibana, was fabricated against him. Or they will say, this book Al-Ibana, he wrote it at the early part of his life, not the end part of his life. And that's also false. Or they will say, this book Al-Ibana, yes, the Mujassima and the Mushabbiha, they got hold of this book and they put things in the book and they ascribed things into the book that he didn't. Mujassima meaning the people of the Sunnah. People of the Sunnah, they got hold of this book and they added things to it that Al-Ash'ari didn't himself. So these are all excuses that they are using to justify not following what is in the final work of Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari. Right? So these are the Ash'aris. And so these are the Ash'aris. And the Maturidis, they are the followers of a man called Abu Mansur al-Maturidi. Abu Mansur al-Maturidi. So he is basically over there in the, beyond Afghanistan, that kind of area, in that direction. And the people who ascribe to him, they are the Maturidis. And again, he does not affirm the attributes except 7 or 8, except 8. I will mention what they are. We'll come to that inshallah ta'ala. So anyhow, these are the Ash'aris and Maturidis. And the Shaykh goes on to say, وَطَرِيقَتُهُمْ أَنَّهُمْ أَثْبَتُوا لِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءِ وَبَعْدَ الصِّفَاتِ. The path of these people is they affirm the names and they negated some of the they affirmed some of the attributes, which are the 7 or the 8, and then they negated the وَنَفُوا حَقَائِقَ أَكْثَرِهَا. They negated the realities of many of the other attributes. وَرَدُّوا مَا يُمْكِنُهُمْ رَدُّهُ مِنَ النُّصُوصِ. Any of the attributes they were able to reject, they rejected. And anything that they could not reject, they distorted its meaning. وَحَرَّفُوا مَا لَا يُمْكِنُهُمْ رَدُّهُ. Right? So some texts they were able to say, well, we don't believe this text is authentic. Right? So they can reject the attribute in that way. Others, if they couldn't reject the attribute because it is in the Quran, or it is in a firmly established hadith, it is mutawatir, they say, they then give it like a interpretation, an allegorical interpretation. And then they call this distortion, they call it ta'wil, that this is a metaphorical interpretation, it is a allegorical explanation. So this is the general approach that they took. So what are the attributes? فَأَثْبَتُوا لِلَّهِ مِنَ الصِّفَاتِ سَبْعَ صِفَاتِ. They affirmed for Allah 7 attributes. What are these attributes? Life, al-hayat, al-ilm, wal-qudra, which is life and knowledge, and power, al-qudra, which is power, al-irada, which is wish or will, wal-kalam, which is speech, as-sam', which is hearing, wal-basar, which is seeing. Right? So they affirm these attributes, even though in some cases they affirm these attributes in a way which opposes the way the people of the Sunnah affirm these attributes. Right. What is the basic principle upon which they affirm these attributes? They said, whatever the intellect indicates can be accepted, can be affirmed, we will affirm it. And whatever the intellect negates what can be affirmed, we will negate it. Right? So can you see from the outset here, what's the issue here? What's the foundation they have made to be the foundational principle? It is the intellect. Right? What did we say the foundation was? Is khabar. It's the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they are saying, anything that the intellect finds acceptable for Allah to be described with, we'll affirm it. And anything the intellect deems to be not befitting Allah and not affirmed for Allah, then we will reject it. Right? And therefore, they rejected many of the attributes of Allah upon the argument that affirming these attributes would necessitate that we are resembling Allah with His creation. We are likening Allah to His creation. Okay, so, right, so now that we know the principle upon which they made to be their speech, about Allah and His attributes, it is what? It is whatever the intellect demonstrates can be affirmed, we affirm it. Whatever the intellect does not demonstrate, we don't affirm it. Right. What's the basic process by which they come to these 7 attributes? Right. We're going to explain what they do. So, this is how they affirm these attributes in a step-by-step sequence. So first of all, they say that bringing something into existence is an evidence of qudra. Qudra is power and ability. Yes? Right? So they look and they say, okay, bringing something into existence, which is ijad, brings me into existence, this clearly proves the attribute of power, qudra, which means ability. Right, so we start from here. And by qudra, obviously we mean power. And then they say that when we look at things, we see that they are specified. They are specified entities. So for example, this is a sky or a heaven, and this is the sun, and that is the moon. Like these are individual specific entities, and the fact that we see this variation in the entities proves that there must be a wish, like a will behind it. Because someone willed for the sun to be the sun, and the moon to be the moon, and the tree to be the tree, and whatever it might be, right? So because of that, because of this variation that we see, variation in flowers and their colors, variation in the beasts and animals, right? This clearly indicates irada. Someone has clearly wished for this to be this, and for that to be that, and for this to be this, right? So then they say, okay, so now we have qudra, power, and we have irada, which the intellect has proven. And then also they say that the fact that there is precision, right, which is ihkam and itqan, which basically means that you see, for example, that the human body, for example, the way that the human body works, and the way the organs are put together, and just everything in general, the precision in everything, and the detail in everything. This clearly indicates what? Indicates knowledge. Indicates knowledge. Because this cannot have come from someone who is ignorant. Right? An ignorant person isn't able to be precise in this manner. Right? And to put things, in this manner. So this now clearly shows knowledge. Okay? So what do we have now? We have qudra, we have irada, and we have knowledge. Knowledge, will, and power. And then they say, knowledge, will, and power must indicate life. Anything that has knowledge, will, and power must have life, because these are the essentials of life. So from the first three attributes, they then derive the fourth attribute. The fourth attribute, which is life. Right? So life, they have argued for life indirectly from the first three. From the first three. Then they say, after establishing life, they say that for anything that is alive, then hearing, seeing, and speaking is a sign of perfection, and its opposite, which is being deaf, dumb, and blind, is a sign of imperfection. Right? So therefore, if Allah is alive, if Allah is living, if Allah has life, He's living, because He has qudra, irada, and ilm, then He must also therefore have a sam' wal basar wal kalam. He must have hearing, seeing, and speech, because these are from perfection. These are from perfection. Right, so these are now 7 attributes. Okay. Now, if you remember, we said in previous lessons that we are not denying that yes, it is possible for reason to arrive at something of knowledge about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, we're not denying that these arguments are necessarily, that they are wrong. These arguments are sound, that clearly the variation in the creation indicates Allah's irada, and so we're not denying this, right? So we're not denying the argument itself, but is this the foundation for speaking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Is the intellect the basis for what can be said of Allah and what cannot be said of Allah? We have to be very precise and careful. This is what we are objecting to, right? This is not the principle as it relates to speaking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So we are not denying that we can acquire some degree of knowledge about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by the application of reason. It's possible to do so, right? But you cannot make that now to be the actual asl, the foundation of all speech about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore say what the intellect deems that Allah can be described with, we describe with. What the intellect does not deem that Allah can be described with, then we don't describe Allah with, right? Because there's going to be problems that are going to arise if you make that to be the principle, right? And the clearest evidence of that is that if all of these groups, the philosophers, Jahmiyyah, Mu'tazila, Ash'aris, are all operating on the same principle, what the intellect says we can affirm for Allah, what the intellect says we cannot affirm for Allah, how come you all differ with each other then? How come this one is saying no names, attributes, actions? How come that one's saying, okay, names yes, but no attributes or actions? And how come that one's saying, well, names yes, and some of the attributes yes, but other attributes no, and the actions no? But you are saying that the intellect is supposed to determine what can and cannot be said of Allah. So why is all this differing then, right? So this clearly shows the futility of the principle in itself, right? That can't be right, because Allah Azza wa Jal, there's no contradiction or incoherence in what Allah has revealed. And Allah didn't task you and your intellect to acquire knowledge about Allah in that way, right? And if that was the case, then why did Allah send the revelation in the first place? If you can know Allah by the intellect, right? So this is the basic process by which they arrive at all of these attributes. And what we're now going to do is look at the response to this position that they have. And so the Shaykh says, وَالرَّدُّ عَلَيْهِمْ مِنْ وُجُوهٍ. So the answer to these people is from numerous angles. Right, so the first one is أن الرجوع إلى العقل في هذا الباب مخالف لما كان عليه سلف الأمة من الصحابة والتابعين وأئمة الأمة من بعدهم فما منهم أحد رجع إلى العقل في ذلك وإنما يرجعون إلى الكتاب والسنة فيثبتون لله تعالى من الأسماء والصفات ما أثبته لنفسه أو أثبته له رسله إثباتا بلا تمثيل وتنزيها بلا تعطيل. Okay, so here the Shaykh is summarizing the first principle and point, which is that this principle of returning to the intellect and making that to be the foundation, this opposes what the companions were upon, the Salaf were upon, all what the Imams were upon, the Tabi'een, and none of them made the intellect to be the criterion or the basis upon which we can affirm or negate from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Rather, they return back to the book and to the sunnah, and they are upon the principles that we mentioned earlier on in the lessons, that they affirm for Allah what He affirmed for Himself and what His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam affirmed for Him. And they affirm that without any likeness, and they negate any likeness from Allah without negating the attribute itself. And so in this respect, Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal rahimahullah, he said, Nasifullah bima wasafa bihi nafsahu wala nata'adda al-Quran wal hadith. What did he say? He said, we describe Allah with what He described Himself. We do not go beyond the Quran and the Hadith. We do not go beyond the Quran and the Hadith. So this is the first point. The second point is that returning back to the intellect is itself an opposition to the intellect, right? So this itself opposes reason. For you to make reason to be the criterion itself is a violation of reason. And why is that? Because we already established in the early lessons, did we not say that although reason can arrive at some knowledge about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah Azza wa Jal is from the unseen. And no one has seen Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And no one therefore is able to describe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala unless Allah Himself reveals that knowledge Himself. And that knowledge Allah has revealed Himself by way of His books and His messengers. This is what reason necessitates, that we, in order for us to speak about Allah, then it has to be on the basis of what Allah Himself has informed us with. That's what reason tells us. So therefore, to say that we make reason to be the criterion for what Allah can and cannot be described with, that itself clashes with reason. Right? So you are opposing reason itself by making this to be the principle in your religion when it comes to speaking about Allah and His names and His attributes. So the Shaykh says, أن الرجوع إلى العقل في هذا الباب مخالف للعقل لأن هذا الباب من الأمور الغيبية التي ليس للعقل فيها مجال. This is in the realm of the affairs of the unseen, in which the intellect has no position, has no role. وإنما تتلقى من السمع. This information is taken only from the revelation. فإن العقل لا يمكنه أن يدرك بالتفصيل ما يجب ويجوز ويمتنع في حق الله تعالى. The intellect is not possible for it to know in detail or to comprehend in detail what must be affirmed for Allah, what is permissible to affirm for Allah, what is impossible to affirm for Allah. So therefore, to employ the intellect and to make it the criterion is mukhalifun lil aql. It itself is in opposition to to intellect itself. And if you recall in the previous lessons, we can illustrate this point even from that which is within the creation, right? So if I said to you, how is the speech of a jinn? Well, you don't know that because you don't know what the essence of the jinn, how it is. Right? What's the essence of a jinn? A jinn is a thing that can come in bodies and go out of bodies, and it can speak, it can eat, but if I was to ask you, use your intellect to describe to me what is the reality of the being of a jinn, well, you can't do so. It's impossible for you to do so. And so the only way you can learn about the jinn is what Revelation has told you. Revelation has told us that the jinn are made from the smokeless part of the flame or of the fire. That's as much as we know. And then we know some other descriptions and abilities of the jinn, rapid travel and rapid communication and possession in the bodies of men, and all the other things that we know. But you are unable because it's from the unseen. The jinn is from the unseen. You can't see the jinn in their original form, right? So you cannot give knowledge about that. So therefore, to say the intellect can now, that's not possible, and that's not possible. So therefore, with respect to Allah Azza wa Jal, who is from the unseen, then the intellect cannot be the basis, and to assume so is itself opposes, it's a violation of reason to do so. The third answer is the Shaykh says, أن الرجوع في ذلك إلى العقل مستلزم للاختلاف والتناقض فإن لكل واحد منهم عقلا يرى وجوب الرجوع إليه كما هو الواقع في هؤلاء. Basically, if you say we return back to the intellect, this is something that is going to necessitate differing and contradiction. Because every person has his own intellect. And he will say, well, no, it's not your intellect, the Ash'aris, rather it's the intellect of the Mu'tazila that we should go back to. No, it's not the intellects of the Mu'tazila, because they're effeminate and they're not really men. It's the intellects of the Jahmiyyah we should go back to. Now, whose intellect are we going back to then? Who's the smartest? Who's the most intelligent? Right? So then we enter into this like nonsense, which then leads to contradiction, incoherence, differing. And as the Shaykh says, he says, كما هو الواقع في هؤلاء فتجد أحدهم يثبت ما ينفيه الآخر. You'll find one of them affirming what the other one negates, right? So the Ash'ari is affirming what the Mu'tazili negates, and the Mu'tazili is affirming what the Jahmi negates. Right? There's all this contradiction between them, and maybe even one person, the same individual, he will contradict himself, where in one place he affirms something, and in another place he negates something. Right? So take for example the Ash'ari. He says, "Oh, I don't affirm a face for Allah. This is making him like to be like the created beings." And then you see him affirming hearing and seeing. Okay, well, how have you managed to affirm hearing and seeing, but you're negating the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Because hearing and seeing, we do not see any creature amongst the creatures of Allah who has hearing or seeing, except that the hearing or seeing is like an organ or a limb. So how can you affirm that then negate this, right? There's contradiction, basically. So therefore, as the Shaykh says, and this is the important thing, فَلَيْسَ لَهُمْ قَانُونٌ مُسْتَقِيمٌ يَرْجِعُونَ إِلَيْهِ. They do not have any sound principle. There's no sound qanun, like sound principle or canon, which they return back to, in which they can show their consistency. They have nothing. And then the Shaykh quotes a statement from Ibn Taymiyyah in his book Al-Hamawiyyah, in which he is quoting, in which he is saying, if only these people, by which intellect are these people weighing the Quran and the Sunnah? How is it that your intellect now is somehow going to evaluate the Quran and the Sunnah as to what Allah can and cannot be described with? How is your intellect the criterion for the Quran? Right? And he quotes from Imam Malik bin Anas, who said, is it the case that every time وَكُلَّمَا جَاءَنَا رَجُلٌ أَجْدَلُ مِنْ رَجُلٍ تَرَكْنَا مَا جَاءَ بِهِ جِبْرِيلُ إِلَى مُحَمَّدٍ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم لِجَدَلِ هَؤُلَاءِ. He said that, is it the case that every time someone comes, claiming to have this intellect and to argue and to debate, and just on account of this debate and argument, are we now going to abandon what Jibreel revealed came with to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, just because of your argumentation and disputation? No, we're not going to do that. Right? So just because you have the philosophers and the Jahmiyyah and the Mu'tazila and the Ash'aris, and they're all engaging in this debate and argument, and perhaps they'll come and debate with us as well, right? Are we now going to abandon and leave what has come in the revelation just because of your polemics and debates and argument? No, we're not going to do that. Right? Because we don't make the intellect to be the basis. Right? So this is the third point that the Shaykh mentions. Right? So the 3 points are, first of all, none of the Sahaba or the Salaf or the Imams of the religion were upon this principle of making the reason to be the criterion of what Allah can and cannot be described. Number 2, to make reason to be that criterion and that principle itself violates reason. It's a violation of reason to do so. Number 3, that to make reason the criterion itself necessitates contradiction, incoherence, splitting, differing, which is the actual reality, as you can see. Because how come you're all like 1, 2, 3, 4, and many other groups, right? There are other groups as well, Karramiyya, Salimiyya, the other groups as well. Why isn't the intellect pointing to the one and the same position, right? This in itself is a clear proof that your principle cannot be correct. Now the fourth one, which we'll mention today and we'll elaborate upon inshallah in the next lesson, is that when these people, they find in the Quran and the Sunnah, إذا صرفوا النصوص عن ظاهرها إلى معنى زعموا أن العقل يوجبه فإنه يلزمهم في هذا المعنى نظير ما يلزمهم في المعنى الذي نفوه مع ارتكابهم تحريف الكتاب والسنة. Alright, so basically they're saying, these people, the Ash'aris, they come across a text and they say, for example, Allah Azza wa Jal mentions in the Quran to Iblis, why did you not prostrate? What prevented you from prostrating? بما خلقت بيدي لما خلقت بيدي. Right? Why? What prevented you from prostrating to that which I created بيدي, with my two hands? So they say, okay, hand here, it cannot be, it cannot be hand, because the first thing they are thinking in their mind is they are thinking the hand in the creation. Right? So they are the ones who are resembling inside their souls first, whereas we do not do that. Right? We don't do that. Because we understand that we know the meaning of what a hand is, right, which is other than hearing and seeing. We know that the hand has a meaning, but the reality of that we have no knowledge of, and it is unlike what is in the creation, right? If you can say, like I can say, explain to me how is the hand of a jinn in its original form, it's impossible for you to do so, because you don't know the reality of the being of the jinn, what the jinn, the essence of the jinn, what it is really. You don't know how that is, because you've never seen it in its original form. And if you haven't seen that, then there's no way you can, even though in your mind you are going to try to think in terms of your own experience, meaning of the hand that you have, right? But the hand of the jinn is not like that. So it's not like that at all, right? Because it's the essence of the jinn is other than the essence of the man, right? So we know that Allah, when He ascribes a hand to Himself, it is totally unlike the hand of the creation, and Allah does have an attribute which is yad, which is hand. Its reality is unknown to us. Whereas what these people will say, oh, the hand, right? So they're the ones who make the resemblance first and think hand means only this hand, right? And then say, we now have to, this, if we leave this verse as it is, this would mean there is anthropomorphism in the Quran. There's tajseem and tashbih in the Quran, right? We have to interpret this. And so they say, well, hand actually means power. Hand is just like a metaphor, allegorical, figurative way of referring to power. Okay? So this principle, the fourth refutation of these people is that whatever you try to do in order to flee from the original meaning to another meaning, the very thing you try to flee from, you haven't escaped it, it applies to the meaning that you've just fled to. Do you understand? Like if you now say Allah's hand means His power, then you say, well, hold on, that power you're affirming for Allah, then you haven't escaped what you're trying to flee from, because the power itself, power that we see in the creation, power only exists from bodies. A man has power. How does he have power? It involves limbs and flesh. A lion has power. An elephant has power. Right? The fire has power. The wind has power. These are all entities which have a being, and which we can say, has like an essence and a being, or a jism, or a jawhar. Right? That's the only way power manifests in this creation. So you've now likened Allah, you've made Allah into a body still. So the thing you try to flee from, you haven't actually fled from it. You fell into the same thing that you tried to flee from. You understand? So this is the fourth point of refutation, which is that whatever you try to flee from by making ta'wil, the ta'wil that you make the new explanation that you invent, then the same thing applies to that as it did to the original thing. Right? So this point we're going to elaborate upon, inshallah, because there's a dialogue now that goes backward and forward with these people to show that what they're doing is they're going to go around in a circle. Right? They're going to go in a circle, and as you refute the arguments, they're going to end up coming back to the same point at the beginning, where we say, well, okay, you just went in this huge loop. Why didn't you just say at the beginning, we believe that Allah has the attribute of hand without any likeness to the creation, and stop there? Instead of going in a huge circle, coming around, contradicting yourself, and then being forced to come back to this position. You understand? So there's a dialogue that takes place here, and this is what comes next. We'll stop now because we've come to the end of our time. But we'll deal with that next, inshallah ta'ala. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.